It was the last Thursday of October 2024 when Fort Bragg sank into that strange hush before a storm. I had just returned from a 14-hour field operation, boots caked with red clay fatigue clinging to my skin like another uniform. The apartment smelled of detergent and gun oil, the two scents that defined my life. I was halfway through removing my jacket when I heard something break inside the living room. Not loud, just a brittle snap, followed by a breath that wasn't mine. I stepped forward, my hand still hovering near my holster, and then I saw her. At first, my brain refused to connect the shape on the floor with anything real. It was me, sitting there, or rather, someone wearing my face. My twin sister Lena, her hair matted with dried sweat, one sleeve torn. Her cheek bruised in shades of yellow and violet that no uniform color chart could name. For a second, I thought I was looking into a cracked mirror. "Lauren," she whispered, her voice hoarse, trembling like a loose wire. I dropped to my knees beside her, the sound of my gear clinking against the floor echoing too loud in that tiny room. "Lena, what happened?" She looked up at me and gave a short laugh that ended as a choke. "You already know," she said. And I did. Not the details, not yet, but the truth was already sitting there between us like a live grenade. She had run from Fort Hood, from her husband, Staff Sergeant Cole Bishop. He had once been the charming NCO everyone admired, the type who bought coffee for recruits and saluted higher ranks with perfect posture. But behind closed doors, he turned command into control affection, into interrogation. I had told her to leave him 2 years ago. She told me love was complicated. Now I was looking at what complicated love looked like when it ran out of excuses. I pressed a towel against her temple. She winced but didn't pull away. "You need to see a medic," I said. She shook her head slowly. "No hospital, no report. He'll find me." The word he hung in the air, heavier than rank. I could have called the MPs, I could have followed protocol, but protocol was built for men like Cole Bishop. Men who knew how to file the right forms and smile through the cracks. Lena reached for my wrist. "You always said the Army was built on honor," she whispered. "Then make them see what honor looks like." Her hand was ice cold, her pulse unsteady. I felt something in me shift then, something sharp and deliberate. The same clarity I used in the field when a plan started to crystallize. I told her to rest, covered her with a blanket, and walked to the window. Outside, the night lights of Fort Bragg flickered faintly, tracing the perimeter fence like a heartbeat. I saw my reflection in the glass and hers overlapping mine, two faces merging into one. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. I turned to her again. "You said he's still stationed at Hood." She nodded. "Same base housing, same unit." My throat tightened. "And nobody's reported him." "They said there's no proof. He knows how to hide it." That was when the thought came clean and cold. If he hid behind his rank, then I would make that rank expose him. Not as Major Creed, but as the woman he believed he owned. I didn't speak it out loud, not yet. I just placed her military ID on the table next to mine. 2 photos. Same face, different stories. The storm outside finally broke rain smearing against the window like streaks of camouflage. I poured her a glass of water and she tried to smile. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. I looked at the 2 IDs again, at the identical signatures, at the way the lamplight blurred our names. "I'm thinking the Army just got 2 Creeds," I said, "and one of them is done staying silent." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her eyes said it all. For the first time in years, she looked like she could breathe. That night, I packed a second duffel bag. My uniform hung pressed and ready, my orders for training already signed. By morning, no one would question why Major Lauren Creed had business in Texas. By morning, Lena would be on a bus heading east wearing my civilian jacket. The switch wasn't just a plan. It was a line we were about to cross, one that couldn't be uncrossed. The mirror cracked cleanly that night, but neither of us looked away. I have seen wounds in the field, in training accidents, in combat drills that went wrong, but nothing prepared me for the pattern I saw on my sister's skin. They were not random. They had sequence and rhythm. I could name each color the way a medic names injury, stages. Deep maroon meant 3 days old, yellow-green meant healing, faint violet meant recent pressure. Someone who knew control had made those marks, someone who understood where pain hides under the surface. I cleaned the cut above her eyebrow using sterile pads from my kit. She flinched when the antiseptic touched her breath, catching for a second. "Hold still," I said softly, but the voice that came out wasn't gentle. It was command. She gave a faint nod like a soldier responding to an order. The habit never really left her. Back in college, when we both joined ROTC, Lena used to copy my drills just to annoy me. She could run the obstacle course faster, but I could plan every move before it happened. We were two halves of the same code, she the heart, I the system. She lasted 2 years before quitting. Said she wanted to live somewhere without ranks or call signs. That was the same semester she met Cole Bishop at a joint training event in Fayetteville. He had the look of a man who could charm a storm. She called me that night and said she'd met someone who finally understood discipline. I told her discipline without empathy becomes control. She laughed. "Not everyone hides behind their stripes, Lauren," she said. I let it go. I had my own promotion boards to worry about, and in the military, silence becomes habit. I didn't realize silence could also become weapon. Now, years later, I was kneeling on my apartment floor, patching up the consequences of her choices. The irony tasted metallic. Lena's eyes drifted toward my rank patch. "You always said pain has a color," she whispered. I looked at her. "And color fades if treated soon enough." "What if it doesn't?" she asked. I wanted to tell her every bruise heals, but that would have been a lie. Some bruises move inward and find a place under your ribs where even time can't reach. Then you repaint the canvas, I said, with something stronger. Her lip trembled, but she stayed silent. Outside, a helicopter moved past its blades, thudding like an unspoken threat. I pressed a final strip of gauze and secured it with surgical tape. "You'll need to rest for a few days," I said. She looked at me exhausted. "You always talk like you're writing a report." "Reports keep people alive," I said. "They also hide the truth," she murmured. She wasn't wrong. I'd written enough evaluations to know how language can soften facts until they lose their edge. I sat back against the wall, watching her fall asleep. The storm had quieted outside, leaving the air heavy and wet. The lamp flickered once before steadying. On the table, our two IDs lay side by side under the yellow light. The resemblance between us was uncanny. Same jawline, same freckles near the left eye. But our expressions in those photos told different stories. Hers smiled too hard. Mine didn't smile at all. My eyes kept drifting to the line under her photo, Spouse Staff Sergeant Cole Bishop. I remembered meeting him once at a holiday dinner years ago. He had perfect posture and the kind of smile that belonged in recruitment posters. He asked me about deployment logistics, and when I answered, his gaze shifted to Lena like he was reminding her who belonged to whom. That night, she brushed it off, saying he was protective. I had seen enough soldiers confuse protection with ownership. Still, I didn't push. The uniform had a way of silencing questions. My mind replayed that dinner, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the quiet tension behind their smiles, and I felt something cold crawl up my spine. I had believed in the system my whole life, believed that chain of command existed to preserve order, but order without conscience turns into complicity. As I sat there, I realized that the bruises on my sister's body weren't just physical. They were the imprints of every unspoken word, every report never filed, every superior who chose convenience over courage. The Army had trained me to identify weak points in a structure. Now I was staring at one built on silence. Lena stirred, whispering in her sleep. Her hand reached out as if searching for something. I took it and held it still. She calmed immediately. I stared at her face, at how peaceful she looked when unconscious, and wondered what peace would cost this time. When the clock hit through 200, I stood, stretched the stiffness from my knees, and turned off the lamp. Tomorrow would bring clarity. Tomorrow I would go over her records, her husband's unit assignments, the internal complaint system. Everything had procedure, even justice. Before heading to bed, I looked once more at the mirror above the sink. My reflection looked different tonight, sharper, colder. The uniform hanging on the chair behind me felt heavier, as if it already knew what I was about to do. I whispered to my reflection, a quiet field vow. Discipline built this cage. discipline will burn it clean. Then I exhaled slowly and let the silence return. I learned early that the military runs on two currencies: orders and silence. The silence is not accidental, it is cultivated and enforced through routine and habit. People at the PX trade stories about deployment rations and training nightmares, but they lower their voices the moment a complaint edges toward a house where a family keeps its dust and its secrets. In base housing, the code is quiet and brutal. You learn to read gestures instead of statements, to notice when a partner flinches at a raised hand or when a child eats in the corner while adults perform polite ritual. There is an unofficial rule older than any standing order: keep the unit intact and do not make waves outside the chain of command. That rule protects readiness and reputations, and in practice, it protects the careers of soldiers who are useful even when they create harm at home. When Lena curled up on my sofa that night with bruises mapped across her skin, I treated the scene like a tactical problem rather than a melodrama. Anger is useful in the field, but it is a liability in the paperwork and interview rooms where evidence matters. You do not storm a command post with only outrage. You bring timelines, witness statements, medical records, and a strategy that will force bureaucracy to move. So, I started with the manual. I pulled up AR 60819, the regulation governing domestic abuse, and the Family Advocacy Program, and read it with the same focus I use on an after-action report. On paper, AR 60818 promises procedures, timelines, and protections. It lays out the duties of commanders, the role of the Family Advocacy Program, and the mandatory steps for documenting injuries and referring victims to support. But paper and practice differ, and the social architecture around installations often tilts the scales toward discretion rather than disclosure. Commanders worry about unit cohesion, deployments, and optics, and complaints that lack clear documentation can be softened into private interventions or counseled away. A spouse who walks into the office with a bruise and a shaking voice is vulnerable to being reframed as an emotional problem rather than a criminal matter. Lena had told me she tried once to mention the hitting to a neighbor and was met with offers to babysit or advice to be quiet rather than the decisive intervention she deserved. Social pressures run deep in military communities where everyone knows someone and rumors travel faster than paperwork. I began to map practical obstacles: the stigma that kept Lena silent, the informal pressure from relatives, the tendency to call domestic incidents private matters, and the systemic habit of protecting skilled soldiers whose utility outweighed their failings. Then I mapped the legal levers AR 60818 actually contained, if one insisted on following procedure documentation timelines, mandatory notifications of family advocacy, and the possible administrative actions that could follow. There were required timelines for the Family Advocacy Program to contact victims, mandatory confidentiality protocols, and prescribed documentation for injuries that could not be ignored if properly recorded. The regulation allowed temporary separations and safety plans and created an evidentiary trail that, if complete, could not be easily dismissed. In other words, the law had teeth, but someone would have to drive them home with persistence and a working knowledge of the bureaucracy that tends to stall these processes. I made a plan that favored documentation over drama photographs with timestamps, medical visits, logged witness statements, and phone logs that traced threats and calls for help. I started calling trusted contacts at Fort Hood, people who owed me favors and who understood how to move a report across pages until it landed on a desk that could not simply shelve it. I taught Lena how to insist on a medical exam, how to describe pain without collapsing into shame, and how to request the family advocacy intake so that the initial steps could not be ignored. She was terrified, but willing, and that willingness mattered more than courage, because courage without plan becomes spectacle, and spectacle can be weaponized against the victim. As I compiled records, I felt the cold satisfaction of assembling an operation that could not be shrugged off by convenience or hierarchy. I told Lena plainly and without flourish, if the Army protected him, then I will make the Army see him. She breathed out a sound that had been trapped for years, and for the first time, her face lost some of its constant tension. I did not promise heroics or violence. I promised paperwork, persistence, and pressure, which in a bureaucracy can be more terrifying than any immediate threat because it can end careers and expose patterns that hide behind rank. The silence code would not stand if evidence replaced rumor and if procedure became pressure from people who refused to look the other way. That night, I set the plan in motion, arranging a medical exam, scheduling witness interviews, and securing a small safe place for Lena to stay while the process began. The regulation was my map, the culture was my obstacle, and my sister was the reason I would not allow temperament or tradition to stall justice. Halloween at Fort Bragg always carried the same nervous laughter, the kind that tried to drown out the weight of routine. That year, 2024, the base looked almost festive. Kids in tiny flight suits ran between duplexes, pumpkins glowed along the curb, and somewhere down the street, someone was grilling ribs. Inside my apartment, the only light came from the bathroom mirror. Lena sat on the counter wrapped in one of my gray towels, her eyes fixed on her reflection as if trying to recognize the person looking back. I stood behind her with a pair of scissors, the sound of blades clicking against the ceramic sink breaking the quiet. "Are you sure?" I asked. "If you stop now, we can still report him. Do it by the book." She shook her head, her voice small but certain. "The book didn't protect me." "You might." I cut the first strand. Hair fell onto the towel like pieces of a former life. My own reflection stared back at me, calm and deliberate, a soldier preparing for a mission that had no field manual. The mirror caught both our faces, the same jawline, the same eyes, only hers carried a soft fear, while mine carried calculation. We didn't speak for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, and each second felt heavier than the last. I took a makeup pencil and marked the small mole near her right cheek, then placed an identical one on mine. The symmetry was unsettling. "You always hated Halloween," she said with a faint smile. "Because people hide behind masks," I answered. "Tonight we just trade them." She exhaled a shaky laugh that turned into a sigh. "You sound like Mom when she used to inspect our Halloween costumes." I remembered those nights when we were kids in Fayetteville, dressing as astronauts, soldiers, nurses, different versions of order and service. We were identical even then, but people always said they could tell us apart by the way we stood. Lena leaned slightly forward. I stood like someone waiting for orders. That habit never died. "You'll need this," I said, handing her my pressed uniform shirt with the name Creed stitched in black thread above the pocket. She stared at it like it was both armor and accusation. Then she slipped it on. The fabric dwarfed her smaller frame, but when she buttoned the last clasp and squared her shoulders, something shifted. She looked less like my sister and more like the ghost of myself in Echo wearing duty as disguise. I, in turn, put on her civilian sweater, the one with a coffee stain near the cuff. It smelled like lavender detergent and fatigue. I took her civilian ID, slid it into my wallet, and placed my military ID next to her purse. 2 lives on a table divided by choice. "If anyone checks, they'll think you're traveling for training," I said. "I'll say you came home to reset." She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if he sees you?" "Then he sees what he created," I said quietly. I trimmed my hair shorter, closer to regulation length, then brushed it the way she used to. The face in the mirror began to blur distinctions until even I couldn't tell where I ended and she began. The mirror scene turned ritualistic, 2 women switching worlds with the precision of a military operation. No spells, no costumes, just calculation and quiet rage. Lena reached for my wrist. "You're not doing this just for me, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm doing this for every report that got buried under rank and every woman who learned to whisper instead of speak." She lowered her gaze. "What if something happens to you?" "Then you tell them I was following orders." We both laughed, a dry, bitter laugh that tasted of exhaustion and irony. At 23:30 hours, I opened the window. The October air rushed in cold and sharp. Outside, the sky looked metallic, clouded with thin mist. In the distance, artillery practice echoed from the range. Soft booms carried by the wind like ghosts marching home. I turned back to her. "When we do this, you leave town before dawn. Bus station, Route 401, Platform 5. Go east to Raleigh, then Dallas. I'll handle the rest." She hesitated, then whispered, "And if you fail, then at least the silence ends with me." She touched my shoulder once, the kind of touch that says goodbye without words. I watched her tie her hair the way mine usually looked under a cap. We stood shoulder to shoulder before the mirror one last time. The reflection stared back, 2 majors, 2 ghosts, 1 purpose. I reached for the light switch, then paused. "We switch not to escape," I said slowly, but to expose. The words hung between us heavy and final. She repeated them softly like a vow, not to escape, but to expose. The lamp went out. The last thing I saw before darkness took the room was our reflection dissolving into shadow, one face blending into the other. By over 100 hours, the apartment was empty. One Creed boarded a bus heading east. The other drove west toward Fort Hood, Texas, where Truth waited dressed in uniform. By the time I crossed the Texas state line, dawn was only a rumor along the horizon. The pickup's dashboard clock blinked 4:47. I had been driving for 13 hours each mile, scraping another layer of hesitation away. When the first green highway signs for Killeen appeared, the world outside the windshield shifted from interstate emptiness to the quiet sprawl of a military town half awake. Gas stations with flickering lights, pawn shops advertising used uniforms, and a Waffle House glowing like a promise of heat. I pulled in. Inside, the smell of bacon grease and burned coffee felt almost comforting. A group of soldiers in PT gear sat in a booth, their laughter cutting through the static of an old radio. They talked about weekend drills, not realizing a ghost was sitting 3 stools away. I ate without tasting, focusing instead on rhythm fork, down sip, coffee count breaths. When they left, I caught a fragment of cadence, 5 syllables pause, 5 more, the start of the morning PT call rolling across the base 2 miles south. It was the sound of order, a heartbeat wrapped in command. By 0500, I drove toward the Fort Hood checkpoint headlights, joining the slow crawl of vehicles waiting for inspection. The guard tower stood tall against the faint orange dawn flags limp in the still air. Soldiers with reflective belts waved each car forward, checking IDs, scanning stickers. I rehearsed the routine silently. Smile once, not twice. Keep answers clipped. "You are Lena Creed, spouse of Staff Sergeant Cole Bishop, returning after visiting family in North Carolina. Nothing about your posture says Major." The guard leaned in flashlight, grazing my face. "Morning, ma'am." ID. I handed him Lena's card. My pulse kept perfect cadence with his scanner's beep. He nodded, returned it, and waved me through. Just like that, the gate swallowed me whole. Inside, Fort Hood stretched wide rows of beige housing water towers, gym domes, and motor pools glistening with dew. Everything smelled of damp soil and oil discipline mixed with decay. It smelled like discipline and rot under it. I drove through the residential sector, slowing near the house that record said was Cole's. Number 218 on a street lined with identical lawns and flags. Curtains drawn, 2 bikes leaned against the porch rail, perfect symmetry, hiding corrosion beneath. I parked 2 blocks away and cut the engine. The base PA system crackled somewhere, a male voice reminding soldiers about safety briefings. Then came the chorus, hundreds of voices shouting cadence rising with the sun. The rhythm vibrated through the truck's metal frame. My chest recognized it, the sound of belonging, but the words twisted inside me now. I wasn't one of them this morning. I was the inspection they never ordered. I watched the house until lights flickered on. A silhouette crossed behind the curtain, broad shoulders, steady gait. Cole. My jaw locked for a second, but I kept breathing through the count I'd practiced. This wasn't the time for fury. It was the time for reconnaissance. He left the house at 5:35 wearing a gray army hoodie and running shoes. He stretched on the porch, checked his watch, and jogged toward the training grounds. Routine made him predictable. Predictability made him vulnerable. I waited 5 minutes, then started the truck and parked in the alley behind the duplex. The key Lena had slipped into my hand before leaving worked in the back door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of detergent and bourbon. The living room was neat, almost sterile. On the mantel sat a wedding photo, Cole smiling Lena or me beside him, framed by an American flag in the background. The sight hit harder than expected. I took a breath and began cataloging. Evidence first. I photographed everything: documents, unopened letters, prescription bottles, the faint dent on the drywall beside the kitchen table. Every detail mattered because bureaucracy respected evidence, not emotion. Upstairs, the bedroom looked staged for inspection. Sheets' tight boots aligned her nightstand empty. On his, a silver lighter engraved with unit numbers. I pocketed it, knowing someday he'd notice. At 06:15, the base intercom echoed reveille. Trumpet notes filled the air bright and indifferent. I froze by the window watching soldiers on the street stop mid-stride, salute the flag as it rose. Even after everything, the gesture tugged at me. Old training doesn't fade. It calcifies. For a moment, I remembered mornings at Bragg saluting beside men and women who believed the system worked because we needed it to. I whispered, if only it had. By 06:30, the street came alive. Kids waiting for buses, wives walking dogs, the rhythm of military domesticity continuing without pause. Fort Hood functioned like a living organism that healed itself by ignoring infection. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. From inside, every corner hummed with denial. I left the house exactly as I found it and stepped back into the gray light. The air was heavy with the smell of fuel and grass. Soldiers ran past, shouting cadence again, voices merging into one relentless echo. I listened until it faded, then whispered the thought that had followed me all the way from North Carolina. Justice has a sound, and it starts quiet before it marches. He came back at 0700 sharp, sweat drying in patches across his army t-shirt, the smell of asphalt and testosterone drifting into the hallway before he even opened the door. I had memorized his routine from Lena's stories, but seeing it was different. He dropped his keys into the same bowl on the table, wiped his face with a towel, and gave that quick, empty smile men wear when they think the room belongs to them. "Morning," he said without looking at me. "You're up early. That's new." His tone carried amusement, not kindness, the sort of tone commanders use when correcting a recruit who finally obeyed. I answered in a voice soft enough to fit the mask. "Couldn't sleep." He poured water into a glass, gulped half of it, and watched me from the corner of his eye. "Guess we both needed a reset." "You were getting too jumpy before I left." He said it like a man noting weather conditions. The casualness of it chilled more than any outburst. I studied him the way I would an enemy briefing the mud on his shoes, meant he'd run the South Trail, the bandage on his knuckle. Suggested recent sparring, the dull ache in his voice, meant he still believed he owned control. When he brushed past me, I caught a faint scent of whiskey hidden under the sweat and soap. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to remind himself the bottle existed. There was a half-finished one in the kitchen cabinet tucked behind protein powder. Lena had mentioned it once, then changed the subject. He opened the fridge, scanning for something, and frowned. "You forgot the eggs again." I forced a small apology. "I'll get them later." He turned eyes narrowing, then shrugged. "You know what? Never mind. You're trying. I can tell." The words sounded generous, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. That was his tactic reward before correction control disguised as compromise. I stood near the counter, pretending to tidy, watching every move. He placed his shoes beside the bench in the living room with surgical precision, laces, straight soles aligned. The order was almost beautiful if you ignored what it hid. A soldier who saluted the flag and beat his wife before dinner. I repeated that line silently, letting it sharpen me. He left for work at 07:30, wearing his fatigues and that smile again. "Don't wait up," he said. "Unit briefing might run late." I nodded. The door shut with a soft click. The moment he disappeared, I exhaled for the first time since he walked in. My hands shook not from fear, but from restraint. I went straight to the small locker in the hallway. Inside were his boots duffel and an old cigar box filled with coins and a lighter. Beneath the box, a flask engraved with his initials and the date of his first deployment. I photographed everything. Every object told a story how he curated his own myth, how he built a shrine to discipline while rotting inside it. The house was a museum of double standards, awards framed on the wall beside a marriage certificate, commendations hanging near a dented picture frame, order and chaos holding hands. Around noon, I walked to the base exchange, blending among other spouses running errands. People greeted me as if I belonged. At the register, a clerk smiled. "You're Cole Bishop's wife, right? He's a good man. Helped us last year with the toy drive." The words scraped against my throat. Yes, I managed a good man. On the drive back, the sun baked the roads until the air shimmered. The town of Killeen looked ordinary dry cleaners, barber shops, strip malls, but every conversation hummed with military rhythm. The line between soldier and civilian blurred so tightly that reputation became currency. By the time I returned home, Cole's truck was already parked out front. I stepped inside, pulse steadying into mission mode. He sat at the table writing something on a clipboard. "We need to talk," he said. I froze halfway to the kitchen. "About what?" "About starting over." He leaned back, folding his arms. "You've been different since you came back. Quieter. I like it. Maybe that trip did you good." He smiled again, the same counterfeit warmth. "You and we just need discipline." He said the word with reverence as if it were scripture. I sat opposite him, careful with every breath. "Maybe you're right," I said. "Discipline fixes everything." He nodded, pleased with himself, and scribbled a note. "Dinner's at 1900. Don't be late." Then he left for the gym. The silence afterward pressed against my skin. I looked at his clipboard training schedule's supply logs, a few handwritten notes that seemed harmless. But one line caught my eye. Inventory Audit BLDG 22A. I recognized the code from a logistics memo back at Bragg. Unauthorized equipment storage. My instincts stirred. Maybe Cole wasn't just a bully. Maybe he was corrupt. The thought steadied me. Evil hides better when it wears uniform, but it always leaves a trail. As the sun set over Fort Hood, I sat at the window watching soldiers march in formation across the street, their cadence echoing faintly through the humid air. Every step, every chant, every salute was a promise of order, and somewhere in that rhythm lived a man who thought order excused cruelty. I whispered the line again, quieter now, like a private note in a combat journal. A soldier who saluted the flag and beat his wife before dinner. It wasn't anger anymore. It was evidence waiting for daylight. Fort Hood was a city pretending to be a base, and I treated it like a battlefield. Every building carried data, every name tag could become leverage, every protocol could be turned against the one who abused it. Revenge without a plan is noise. Revenge with logistics becomes a system. I mapped mine in 3 layers: physical, psychological, institutional. Physical would keep me alive. Psychological would weaken him, and institutional would finish him. It started with observation. By day, I moved through routines as Lena buying groceries, greeting neighbors pretending to care about base gossip. By night, I cataloged everything: what time Cole came home when he drank, who visited, what calls he made, what emails popped on his screen before he locked it. He was careless because he thought she had learned obedience. That arrogance was my entry point. I found his password scribbled on a notepad behind the cabinet, a pattern of deployment years and unit numbers. That gave me access to the internal portal, the base network where incident reports, maintenance requests, and supply forms lived. Each log was a thread. Together, they formed a map of small violations equipment signed out but never returned gas receipts without matching travel orders, time cards edited after midnight. Nothing large enough to ruin a career, but enough to reveal pattern, a man who knew rules well enough to bend them safely. I saved everything on an encrypted drive I hid under the sink. The house became a command post disguised as domestic space. I used my training like a metronome. Wake at 0500. Run 3 miles to clear noise. Review data logs. File civilian errands under Lena's name. Smile at the commissary. At night, record voice notes time-stamped monotone. Subject returned home 1832 hours. Consumption 2 fingers of whiskey. Behavior elevated volume, no contact. The rhythm of surveillance was colder than anger. Emotion blurs detail. Detail builds cases. I planned the physical layer first. The locks on every door were inspected, escape routes memorized. I replaced the front porch light with one containing a hidden micro camera, its feed linked to my phone. A small recording device was planted behind the vent in the living room where he liked to sit. When he shouted, I captured decibels. When he threatened, I captured tone. The evidence would speak when words failed. The psychological layer required patience. I moved things subtly, keys 1 inch from usual spot, a report left open on his desk. Small dissonances that made him doubt his memory. He began muttering to himself, rechecking drawers, blaming stress. Each act was surgical precise. Guilt and paranoia are corrosive twins. The institutional layer was the long game. Using the base network, I sent anonymous tips to the internal ethics channel citing discrepancies in equipment inventory. I cross-referenced his login times with facility camera logs, highlighting inconsistencies no one had noticed because no one wanted to look. Bureaucracy sleeps until data rattles its cage. When the first audit notice hit his inbox, I watched him unfold the paper at breakfast. He read it twice, expression blank, then crumpled it and threw it into the trash. He assumed it was routine. Routine is how downfall begins. I sat across the table, pretending confusion, stirring coffee as my mind calculated next steps. Every operation needs escalation points, but never too fast. The key was to make him unravel at his own pace while the institution built a paper trail behind him. Justice requires logistics, I told myself. It was the mantra that replaced prayer. I understood systems, how they resist confrontation but crumble under sustained pressure. Men like Cole believe control equals immunity. They never see the structure turning against them until it's already done. In the evenings, I visited the family advocacy office under the pretense of counseling. I asked about confidentiality clauses, how records were stored, how reports could be reopened if new evidence surfaced. I left each meeting with polite smiles and a growing map of loopholes. I learned which officers dismissed complaints quickly and which ones logged them quietly for later use. The same uniform that once silenced me now gave me language to weaponize silence itself. Days bled into weeks. Cole's temper flickered unpredictably. Small things set him off: dust on a shelf, a misplaced remote. He started apologizing afterward, almost mechanical. "You know I didn't mean it." I would nod, recording the words later in my notes with time and date. Each apology was another brick in the case I was building. Sometimes at night, I lay awake listening to cadence calls echoing faintly from the base. Those voices that once anchored me to purpose now felt hollow. They spoke of duty, honor, respect, the same words men like him used as camouflage. I realized the system itself mirrored him, disciplined on the outside, decayed within. I didn't hate the Army. I hated the rot pretending to be structure. My operation wasn't revenge. It was maintenance. Clean out infection, restore function. Justice requires logistics, and logistics was the only language I still trusted. Revenge isn't fire. It's containment. A good officer knows when to burn slow. I started that morning by setting the house exactly how he liked it. Plates aligned, bed corners tight, the illusion of obedience precise enough to fool him into routine. I needed him comfortable. Cameras do not catch truth unless the liar forgets the stage. In the lining of my denim jacket between the stitching and the pocket seam, a button camera blinked red once before disappearing into standby. I had modified it myself during training years ago, a compact recorder designed for field reconnaissance, now repurposed for a domestic battlefield. The microphone rested under the collar, hidden behind a layer of thread. The second camera sat above the kitchen cabinet, camouflaged by a small jar of cinnamon sticks. Both would record until the memory card filled. I wasn't looking for spectacle. I was collecting inevitability. Cole came home earlier than usual, the sound of his boots hitting the floorboards sharp enough to set the air trembling. "You didn't answer your phone," he said before even seeing me. I kept my tone flat. "I was cleaning. You always have an excuse." He threw his keys onto the counter, the metal clatter echoing. He looked tired, but his kind of tired was dangerous. It made him seek control to feel awake. I stayed near the table camera, angled, voice calm. "What happened?" "Nothing you need to know," he said, grabbing the whiskey from the cabinet. "Another audit. Some idiot lost track of inventory. They're dragging everyone through paperwork." I filed that away silently. His irritation meant the audit I triggered had reached him. "That's stressful," I said evenly. "Maybe they'll figure it out soon." He shot me a look that could slice through steel. "Don't patronize me, Lena." The name hit like a slap, but I didn't flinch. He stepped closer, the smell of alcohol cutting through the air. "You think I don't notice when you move things the remote?" "My boots! What are you trying to pull?" I kept breathing, one count in, one out. "I just cleaned." "You're lying." His voice rose sharp and fast. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound vibrating through the wood. The camera above caught every frame, the tilt of his shoulders, the twitch of his jaw, the anger rehearsed and repeated. "You used to know your place," he hissed. "Now you look at me like you've got orders." "Maybe I finally do." I said quietly. His head snapped toward me. For a heartbeat, the world stopped moving. His eyes darkened, searching for submission. None came. He leaned forward, palms flat on the table, breath steady but venomous. You forget who feeds you, Lena. You forget who the army listens to. He wanted fear. I gave him stillness, the kind of stillness that unnerves predators. The silence stretched until something in him cracked. The chair scraped violently as he kicked it aside. Say something, he barked. You think you can just stand there? I said slowly. You're scared. That word detonated between us. His hand shot forward, hitting the table so hard the water glass toppled. It shattered across the floor, water streaking through the dust. He froze, realizing too late that his performance had witnesses he couldn't see. I didn't move. The camera caught everything, the shift from dominance to uncertainty, the flicker of panic when he recognized how far he'd gone. His breathing roughened. Clean it up, he said, finally retreating a step. I said clean it up. I crouched, collected the pieces methodically. One shard nicked my finger. A bead of blood swelled, then dropped onto the wooden surface. I watched it fall in slow motion, crimson spreading into the grain like ink writing its own report. That single drop was everything, a timestamp, a truth, a record no one could erase. I stood, pressed the towel to my finger, and met his gaze. You should get ready, I said softly. You've got work. He frowned, confused by my calm, but routine saved him again. The need to appear composed in uniform outweighed the need to assert control. He muttered something about discipline, grabbed his keys, and left. When the door closed, I stayed still, heartbeat loud but steady. I touched the camera's hidden switch and watched the red light flicker again. Footage saved. The house smelled faintly of whiskey and adrenaline. I washed the blood off, dried the table, and whispered to the empty room. Controlled burn complete. The words steadied me. This wasn't rage anymore. It was structure. Fire in containment purifies. Let it spread too early and you lose control. But burn slow and even rot turns to ash. By the time the footage was stored and encrypted, I had stopped seeing it as evidence and started treating it as ammunition. One video wasn't enough to expose a monster in uniform. Institutions required patterns, connections, names that linked misconduct to corruption. Justice moved slow, but systems rot from the inside. I needed to find the rot. Cole's laptop provided the first crack. He used a common password, predictable and lazy, the same one I had seen scribbled on a notepad, his old unit designation, followed by his deployment year. Inside his inbox, the pattern unfolded fast, vague subject lines, encrypted attachments, and a series of invoices for vehicle parts that didn't match any authorized unit requisition. I cross-checked them against Fort Hood's logistics records. Half the parts were never logged into the base inventory. They simply vanished. The theft ring wasn't new. It was routine. Men like Cole knew how to bleed the system one bolt at a time. The operation was small enough to hide behind bureaucracy, but large enough to make money. He wasn't just a man who hid his wife. He was part of a structure that stole under the flag of discipline. I printed the records and locked them away. This wasn't something I could expose alone. It would require someone who understood the system's underbelly, someone I could trust to walk the edge without asking too many questions. That meant Ramirez. Sergeant Miguel Ramirez had been my logistics NCO back at Bragg, a man who believed spreadsheets were just tactical maps written in numbers. We hadn't spoken in 2 years, not since I transferred commands, but I remembered the look in his eyes the day he watched a superior bury an incident report. That kind of disillusionment doesn't fade. I reached out through a secure messaging line we used during deployment. Need a quiet favor. No questions until I say. Fort Hood. Possible theft ring. You in? He replied in less than 5 minutes. Always. Send breadcrumbs. I uploaded sanitized copies of the files, removing names, but leaving enough context for him to understand scale. Within hours, he texted back. You're dealing with something bigger than one base. These guys funnel parts through dummy accounts, multiple units. If Bishop's name is there, he's low tier but protected. Protected. That word stung. It explained why every small infraction of his had been filed under administrative review instead of formal charges. The Army protected him because he looked efficient on paper. Men like him were the gears that kept machinery moving even when they corroded everything around them. I stared at the printouts on the table, the columns of falsified entries. The logic was perfect, cold, impersonal. Exactly like him. I called Ramirez using a burner phone and kept my tone clipped. I need a verification route, something that ties his name to the missing equipment. Already on it, he said. But Major, whatever you're digging, don't do it alone. You poke this machine too hard and it bites. It already did, I said quietly and hung up. For 3 nights, I barely slept. I moved between the computer, the surveillance footage, and the base network like a ghost weaving through static. Each new discovery led to another name, another timestamp, another file signed off by the same small circle of men. Cole's name appeared near the bottom of a shipment request code, number 1472A, signed 3 months ago, flagged once for audit, but cleared the next day. Someone higher up had erased the red mark. The realization hit hard. The system didn't fail. It collaborated. The whistle of evening drills outside carried through the window, cadences echoing under the orange Texas sky. Discipline is protection, Cole had said once. Maybe for him it was. For others, it was a blindfold. I sent Ramirez the final files. His reply came just before midnight. I can push this to CID, but it'll trigger alerts. You ready for heat? That's the point, I whispered to the empty room. I pressed send. A few minutes later, the phone buzzed again. Be careful, Creed. People disappear quietly when they cross the wrong rank. I didn't answer. I'd already disappeared once. It was the price of infiltration. The next morning, Cole acted strange. He checked his phone too often, muttered to himself. He knew something was wrong, but not where the threat came from. That was good. Fear is a slow acid. It eats control molecule by molecule. I watched him from across the room, every gesture logged in memory. He slammed his locker at one point, muttering about auditors. Then he turned, saw me watching, and smiled as if nothing were broken. You look different, he said. Maybe you finally learned your place. I almost laughed. If only he knew how misplaced his world had already become. That night, I drove to the edge of the base, parked under a flickering streetlight, and stared at the rows of vehicles lined up behind the fence. Everything looked precise, disciplined, invulnerable. But I knew the truth now. The rot lived inside the order. You couldn't smell it until it spread. I whispered into the recorder clipped to my jacket. If you ever served with someone who hid behind rank, you know what I mean. Where are you watching from? The line wasn't just for the file. It was a message to whoever would one day hear the story. It was the first public crack in the silence. And the silence was starting to bleed. Fort Hood had 1,000 offices that looked the same: neutral walls, muted carpet, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights, but the one that mattered most was the Office of Military Police. It held the reports that disappeared, the paperwork that could have changed everything if anyone had ever sent it up the chain. I had spent days studying the security pattern: who arrived early, who left late, which door malfunctioned long enough to slip through without a signature. Revenge was a plan, but exposure was a schedule. At 2140 hours, the admin wing was nearly empty. I wore Lena's base spouse badge clipped beside a stack of grocery bags as camouflage. To anyone passing by, I looked like someone dropping off dinner for a tired soldier. My uniform was hidden in the truck. The only thing that identified me as Lauren Creed Major was the Army-issued ID in my left pocket, and on it, the faint, embossed letter L at the end of my serial number. One wrong glance, one misplaced scan, and the switch would collapse. Inside the office, the air was cold enough to sting. Rows of metal filing cabinets lined the back wall, each labeled with coded unit numbers and dates. I had memorized the format family advocacy cases were tagged by fiscal year, then by the initiating unit. I followed the sequence until I found 2023 FA TX 1127. The drawer slid open with a metallic sigh. Dozens of manila folders stared back at me, neatly stacked, their corners color-coded with adhesive tabs. Most were blue or yellow, standard investigations closed or transferred. Only one was red. Red meant restricted files held under unit discretion unprocessed because a commanding officer decided internal resolution was more convenient than formal record. The Army's polite way of saying buried alive. I pulled it out slowly. The label read, Bishop Cole S. Domestic incident. Confidential. Do not disseminate. Inside photographs, Lena's bruises faint and grainy. Statements unsigned. A report partially filled by a family advocacy officer, and a single sticky note across the top page, pending CO review, do not elevate. My stomach tightened. The date was 9 months ago. They had known, they had documented, and they had chosen silence. I stared at the officer's signature, Lieutenant Colonel M. Harding. He had been Cole's commanding officer during his last rotation. Harding was known for efficiency for keeping his unit clean. Clean meant quiet. The file felt hot in my hands. For a second, I imagined walking straight to CID with it, dropping it on their desk and demanding they look. But timing mattered. If I acted too soon, Cole would know the source. He'd connect the dots between the audit, the footage, and this file. The trap needed one more turn. I photographed every page, aligning each shot with timestamp precision. Then I replaced the folder exactly where it had been. As I closed the drawer, footsteps echoed down the hall. 2 sets, steady male, confident. My pulse accelerated. I ducked behind a partition, holding my breath. The door opened. Light spilled in. Voices, 2 MPs talking about the upcoming training inspection. They stopped near the copier, one of them yawning. "Man, these red tabs freak me out," he said. "Means command got messy." The other laughed. "Nah, it just means someone's career got saved." The words crawled under my skin. They left after a minute, never looking my way. When the hallway fell silent again, I exhaled slowly, the sound too loud in the stillness. I walked out, every muscle locked in discipline, and stepped into the night air. The base was quiet wind sliding across the open lot, carrying the faint echo of distant cadence. I made it to the truck, locked the doors, and finally allowed my hands to shake. For the first time since the switch fear crept in. Not fear of Cole, but fear of exposure. The badge in my pocket felt heavier than steel. That embossed L glowed under the streetlight when I took it out. Lauren, the one detail that could undo everything. I thought about burning it, but I couldn't. I needed it for access. I just had to be perfect until the end. On the drive back, headlights from a convoy flashed across my windshield, throwing brief shadows of soldiers marching through the mist. I envied them for a moment, the comfort of following orders, of not knowing the system they trusted could hide monsters in its paperwork. Back at the house, I uploaded the photos to the encrypted drive, labeling the folder simply Red File. The screen's glow lit the room in pale blue, the kind of sterile light that exposes everything and forgives nothing. I zoomed in on the signature again. Harding's pen stroke was steady, deliberate. He hadn't hesitated to silence her. The system hadn't failed my sister. It had protected its own. My reflection in the screen looked colder than before, the lines around my eyes deeper, the focus sharper. I was starting to understand that justice wasn't about righteousness, it was about endurance. The next morning, Cole noticed the tension before I spoke. "You look tired," he said, watching me closely. "Did you sleep enough?" I answered, masking the tremor in my voice. He smiled faintly, as if comforted by my fatigue. "Good. Don't overthink things. People who think too much make mistakes." His words hung between us, deliberate. For the first time, I wondered if he somehow knew. Maybe he had seen the same faint mark on my badge. Maybe he just sensed the distance growing between fear and defiance. Either way, the endgame was closing in. The red file existed. The system had blinked. And for the first time, the silence on base felt nervous. The annual unit family picnic was designed to remind everyone that the Army was a family first, a hierarchy second. Long tables stretched across the base field grills smoked under the Texas sun, and laughter echoed from every corner. Children played tug-of-war while their parents in uniform swapped deployment stories, pretending the world outside the gate didn't exist. I had rehearsed my movements for 3 weeks, every second mapped like a training op. The hidden camera inside my denim jacket was live transmitting through a secure feed to a burner phone synced to the base's family Facebook page. Ramirez had built the loop quietly, the post set to broadcast the moment I pressed a single command. All I had to do was survive the next hour. Cole stood near the flagpole surrounded by his peers, drink in hand, talking too loud, laughing too freely. He looked invincible under daylight. No one suspected the darkness behind the smile. He waved me over. Lena, he called, voice booming with cheer. Come say hi to the guys. I walked across the grass, each step measured. The heat pressed against my uniform, sweat running down my spine, but my face stayed calm. This is my wife, he said, proudly placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. She's been keeping me in line right, honey. I smiled thinly, the kind that hurts your teeth. One of the soldiers joked about domestic life. Another clapped Cole's back. Everyone laughed. I looked at him and thought, this is what protection looks like when it wears medals. The camera captured every frame. He leaned closer, whispering through the grin. Don't embarrass me today. The words brushed against my ear like static. Wouldn't dream of it, I said. The tension was microscopic, invisible to the crowd, but vibrating in the air between us. The picnic carried on. Kids lined up for snow cones, officers made speeches about honor and resilience. I waited until the sky turned gold and shadows lengthened. Cole drank more confidence, sharpening into arrogance. He told stories louder, made jokes at my expense, nudged me whenever the crowd laughed. Each nudge was a reminder of what waited behind closed doors. Then he made his mistake. One of the wives mentioned the audit, how stressful the new inventory review had been. Cole's smile faltered for a split second, then he barked a laugh. Stress is for people who get caught, he said. I caught the edge in his tone, the tremor of guilt behind bravado. I turned slightly, my voice low but deliberate. Maybe that's why you look so tired lately. The words hit him like shrapnel. His expression froze, then hardened. What did you say? Nothing, I answered, still calm. Just an observation. He stepped closer, his drink sloshing over his hand. Don't start this here. Start what I asked. The circle around us went quiet, their laughter fading into confusion. Cole's breathing quickened. The alcohol had loosened his leash. He grabbed my arm too tight, fingers pressing into skin. You think you can talk back to me? His voice dropped low but dangerous. You forget your place again. Every pair of eyes turned our way. The moment stretched thin as wire. I could feel the camera's light blinking through the fabric over my heart. Let go, I said quietly. Now. He didn't. He shoved. Not hard enough to kill, just enough to humiliate. The world tilted. The ground met my palms. A plate crashed beside me. The sound shattered the silence. Then came the collective gasp. Dead silence, then screams. I didn't move right away. The shock worked in my favor. The feed on the base Facebook page went live the instant I hit the ground. Ramirez's code took less than 2 seconds to connect. The video showed everything. The grip, the shove, the crowd's frozen disbelief, the face of a man who hid behind his rank too long. It streamed directly to hundreds of phones across Fort Hood. Within a minute, notifications started buzzing through pockets. I stood dust clinging to my sleeves, eyes locked on his. Everyone saw, I said. He blinked, confusion flickering as the first whispers spread through the crowd. Soldiers glanced at their phone screens, reflecting horror. A lieutenant shouted, "It's on the page! It's live!" The world flipped. Cole's hand dropped, his face drained of color. "What did you do?" he hissed. "What did you exposed you?" I said. My voice carried farther than I expected. "You wanted control. Now you have an audience." The crowd erupted. Some officers moved to separate us. Others just stared, disbelief rendering them still. Someone grabbed his arm. Someone else filmed again. He tried to speak, but the words drowned under the noise, the wails of children, the muttered curses of soldiers realizing they were watching the collapse of one of their own. For a second, the sound of discipline itself fractured. I stood in the center, the sun blazing over my shoulder, heartbeat even. He lunged forward, shouting my name, but 2 MPs arrived almost instantly, alerted by the live stream. They pinned him back, commanding him to stand down. "Sir, you're done," one said firmly. "You need to come with us." He fought for a moment, then stopped, his strength dissolving into disbelief. The entire base watched in real time as the myth of Sergeant Cole Bishop crumbled. As they led him away, his eyes found mine. "You think they'll believe you?" he spat. "You're nothing." "Then I've got nothing to lose," I said. The MPs pushed him into a patrol car. Around me the noise dimmed, replaced by murmurs and the faint ring of someone's phone still playing the live stream. The comments were already pouring in words like "coward disgrace," finally. The Army's family picnic had turned into a courtroom under the open sky. I pressed a hand over the hidden camera, feeling its heat fade as the feed ended. The mission was complete. Exposure wasn't revenge. It was revelation. And the silence that had protected him for years had finally broken its own code. The sound of sirens shattered the base calm before sunset fully settled. CID trucks rolled in fast, their lights flickering red and blue against the white tents and crushed soda cans still scattered across the field. The family picnic was over. The theater had turned into a crime scene. Soldiers stood frozen, some still clutching paper plates, their faces pale with disbelief. Cole sat on the ground near the patrol car, wrists locked in steel cuffs. His face caught somewhere between fury and fear. I stayed 20 feet away, arms crossed, blood pounding quietly in my ears. The camera inside my jacket was still warm, the data safe. 2 CID agents moved toward me, one with a notepad, the other with the practiced neutrality of someone who had seen this pattern too many times. "Ma'am, you're the spouse," the taller one asked. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Lena Bishop, we're going to need your statement. You can come with us now or after medical. Now is fine." He nodded to his partner, who guided me toward a transport SUV. Behind me, Cole shouted something I couldn't make out, words drowned in the noise of radios and the low hum of engines. They drove me to the CID office, a beige building with no windows and too much air conditioning. Inside, the room smelled of paper and tension. I sat in front of a metal table under a single buzzing light. The investigator across from me introduced himself as Special Agent Morrison. He was mid-40s, calm expression unreadable. "You understand this interview is being recorded?" "Yes," I replied. "You have the right to have counsel present, but since this appears to be an incident of domestic disturbance, we're keeping it preliminary." "You okay with that?" "Yes." He pressed record. "Start from the beginning," he said. I described the picnic, the shove, the reaction. My tone was clinical, stripped of emotion, the way I was trained to deliver an after-action report. Morrison scribbled notes, occasionally glancing up. "You seem very composed," he said finally. "That's not a criticism, just an observation." "I was trained to stay calm under pressure," I said. "Before marriage, ROTC," I answered automatically, then bit my tongue. He tilted his head. "Interesting. Most spouses don't reference training that way." The air tightened. I forced a small, shaky laugh. "Old habit. My dad was Army." He nodded slowly, not convinced, but not ready to challenge. "Do you have any prior incidents on record?" "No official ones," I said truthfully. But there was a report that never went through. I reached into my bag and handed him the printed photographs from the red file. His eyes flicked over them, recognition dawning. "Where did you get these, friend at Family Advocacy?" I said smoothly. "They thought it might finally matter." He studied me for a long moment. "You know, referencing this without proper chain of custody could complicate things." AR 190-30 Section 4, I recited evenly. CID investigators are authorized to collect supplementary materials from civilian sources in cases of domestic misconduct where base personnel are involved. This qualifies. The corner of his mouth twitched, a mix of surprise and respect. "You quote regulations better than some officers I know." "My husband reads them out loud," I said dryly. He almost smiled. The tension thinned for a second before his eyes sharpened again. "Your ID." I handed over Lena's card. He scanned it, then frowned. "The corners smudged. These new ones always are." My pulse kicked up, but I said nothing. He placed it down carefully. "Ma'am, just to confirm, your date of birth is July 11th, 1989. "Yes," I said. The answer was Lena's, and I knew it too well. He nodded but didn't look away. "Strange," he murmured, flipping through his notes. You just cited a regulation most active duty personnel don't memorize. My husband liked to quiz me, I said, smiling faintly. You pick things up. His pen hovered, and yet your composure feels trained. I leaned forward slightly. Agent, are you implying that being calm disqualifies me as a victim? He hesitated. No. Just rare. Maybe because rare is what it takes to survive men like him. Silence stretched. Finally, he exhaled and shut the folder. We'll need to hold you on base overnight for formal statements and evidence collection. You'll be safe. We've assigned an officer to the house until we finish processing. Understood, I said. He watched me as I stood. For a second, I thought he'd call me out, that he'd see through the layers of calm and regulation to the woman wearing another's name. Instead, he said quietly, You did well, Mrs. Bishop. Whatever happens next, you're safe now. Safe. The word didn't fit. Outside, the night felt wrong, too open, too visible. I rode back to the duplex in silence, escorted by a young MP who kept glancing at me in the mirror. When we arrived, he offered to walk me in. I declined. Inside, the house was spotless. The table where Cole had slammed his hand days earlier still bore the faint mark in the wood. I touched it once, almost gently, then sat down. For the first time, fear slid under my skin, not of him, but of discovery. One wrong cross-check, one mismatched fingerprint, and everything would unravel. I took out the hidden drive from under the sink and held it in my palm. It contained everything. His confessions, his violence, the stolen files, the red file copies. It was the truth, but the truth had my fingerprints, not Lena's. The clock ticked past midnight. Outside, a patrol vehicle idled at the corner, keeping watch. I stared out the window at the base's floodlights cutting through fog and whispered to the darkness, You wanted exposure. Now you have it. But justice isn't over yet. Somewhere out there, CID was connecting the dots, and I wasn't sure which version of Creed they'd find when the light finally reached me. The base felt quieter after the arrest, but it wasn't peace. It was the silence that follows a blast when everyone's ears still ring and no one wants to speak the truth out loud. Cole's name floated through corridors like a cautionary tale. The officers called it an incident. The younger soldiers called it the picnic thing. I called it proof. Still, proof had weight, and I could feel it pressing against my chest every time someone said my sister's name. Lena Bishop. Every time it hit the air, it felt like theft. I lasted 4 days before calling Ramirez. We met at a gas station outside Killeen, where the hum of traffic drowned secrets better than any classified room. He leaned against his truck, arms crossed, eyes scanning for tails, even though neither of us believed they'd waste manpower on surveillance yet. They've got him locked down, he said. CID opened a full investigation. Your video broke through every firewall in the chain. Good, I said. That was the point. No, he said quietly. That's not what I meant. They're cross-checking names, witnesses' dates, and your ID. I looked at him, then knowing he already suspected. Ramirez wasn't stupid. He'd served under me long enough to recognize cadence, tone, precision. How long have you known I asked? Since the first text, he said. Lena didn't write like that. You do, so tell me why. I took a slow breath, letting the Texas air scrape my throat dry. Because she deserved peace, I said. So I borrowed her face. The words landed between us heavy and irreversible. Ramirez didn't speak for a while. He just stared at the horizon where the sun was bleeding out behind the power lines. She doesn't know you're still doing this, he asked finally. No. She's in Dallas. I made sure she stayed hidden. He nodded slowly, running a hand over his jaw. You know if CID figures this out, they'll eat you alive. Fraud impersonation, falsified access. Even with your record, they'll bury you. Then let them try, I said. I've been buried before. He gave a bitter laugh. You always did think justice was a campaign plan. It is, I said. Justice has its own chain of command. You follow it whether or not anyone else salutes. He fell quiet again, watching me like a man studying the edge of a cliff. And her? How's she living with all this? The question pulled me into memory before I could answer. Dallas. A week before the picnic. Lena had rented a small room above a laundromat, curtains-drawn walls covered with silence. I'd called once from a burner phone just to hear her voice. She answered on the third ring. "Lauren, you're safe." "Yes," she said, though her tone carried the kind of guilt that corrodes even in safety. "I keep watching the news. Nothing yet." "Good," I told her. "You don't need to know when it happens." "But I will," she said softly. "I'll feel it." I remember the pause that followed the sound of her breath catching. "Do you ever think we went too far?" she asked. "No," I said. "We just went where they told us not to." When I hung up, I'd stood by the window watching laundry spin in the machines below, the colors blurring together until they looked like insignia caught in water. That was the last time I heard her voice. Back in Killeen, Ramirez pulled a small envelope from his jacket. They reopened the old red file. "Harding's out. Command suspended him pending review." I took the envelope, scanned the top sheet. "You did this, no," he said. "You did." I just made sure they couldn't hide it again. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Trucks rumbled past headlights, carving short-lived paths of light across the asphalt. "So, what happens now?" he asked. "They'll clear Lena officially. The records will show she was the victim. Cole's facing charges beyond assault, fraud, theft, falsified inventory. His friends flipped faster than expected. And you, I'd disappear," I said, "the same way I came." He shook his head slowly. "You can't keep living in borrowed names." "Names are paper," I said. "Honor's what you keep when the paper burns." Ramirez sighed, looking older than he was. "You always made revenge sound poetic." "It's not revenge," I said. "It's correction." The phrase lingered like a benediction. He started the truck but hesitated before driving off. "Creed," he said, using my real name for the first time since I arrived. "If you ever need extraction, call me. But next time try fighting from the right side of the badge." I watched his taillights fade into the dark, then turned toward the empty road leading back to base. For the first time, I felt the fatigue seep deep into my bones. The kind that comes not from running, but from carrying too much truth for too long. Justice had its own chain of command. I had followed it without permission, and in doing so, I'd broken it clean. As I drove through the gates, the guard saluted out of habit. He didn't know who I was, and maybe that was fitting. I wasn't Major Creed or Lena Bishop anymore. I was the space between them, the proof that silence could wear two faces and still speak louder than rank. The Article 32 hearing was held inside a temporary courtroom erected within the administrative wing, a space that smelled of coffee and consequence. Rows of soldiers filled the benches, their uniforms pressed so tightly it looked like the fabric itself held its breath. Cole Bishop sat at the defense table, his wrists free for now, but his career already shackled. His face was pale eyes darting between his attorney and the crowd searching for sympathy he no longer owned. I stood in the back, still under Lena's name, but wearing the uniform again, a calculated risk. If the Army wanted truth, it would hear it from a soldier, not a spouse. CID had gathered their evidence, the videos, the stolen inventory trail, the forged requisitions, the red file Harding buried. Justice had moved from rumor to record. The prosecutor, Captain Andrews, opened with a voice that cut through the air like a drill sergeant's cadence. "Sergeant Cole Bishop is charged under Article 128 for assault, Article 121 for larceny, and Article 107 for false statements. His conduct violated not just law, but honor." The word honor landed heavy in the room. I kept my eyes fixed on him, waiting for his mask to crack. When the prosecutor played the picnic footage, the silence was suffocating. On screen, Cole's hand struck like lightning, my body falling, the crowd gasping. Then came the whispers, the collective recoil of people realizing the myth they'd saluted was a lie. Cole's attorney objected, citing emotional manipulation. The judge, a colonel with silver hair and a spine carved from regulation, denied it. "Let the Army see itself," he said. When my name was called, I walked forward slowly, every step deliberate. The room shifted, soldiers whispered. To them, I was still the spouse, but my bearing betrayed me. I took the oath, stood straight, and faced the defense table. Cole's eyes locked on mine, recognition flashing confusion right behind it. He tilted his head slightly as if trying to decode the change. The prosecutor began gently. "Mrs. Bishop, Can you tell the court what happened at the family picnic? He pushed me, I said, after threatening me in front of others. It wasn't the first time. What do you mean he used control as affection? Isolation as loyalty? Obedience as proof of love? Andrews nodded. And how long did this pattern last? Too long, I said quietly, because people who should have intervened chose silence. Cole's attorney rose. Objection, subjective speculation. The judge overruled again. The tension thickened. Then came the cross-examination. Mrs. Bishop, the defense, began emphasizing the title, "You seem unusually composed for a victim." I met his gaze steadily. Some of us are trained to stay composed. Trained ROTC. I answered, echoing my old lie. The courtroom shifted again. Curiosity, confusion, doubt. He leaned closer. You expect this court to believe a victim can quote regulations, infiltrate a chain of command, and record an assault like a tactical operation? No, I said softly. I expect this court to believe in evidence. That line landed. The defense attorney exhaled sharply, regrouped. You hated your husband's career, didn't you? You wanted to ruin him. I wanted to expose him, I said. There's a difference. He smirked. You must have learned that distinction somewhere, Major Creed. The room froze. The air turned to glass. For a fraction of a second, I saw it on his face, the satisfaction of someone who thought he'd unmasked me. The prosecutor objected immediately, but the damage was done. Cole blinked, realization dawning. His lips curled into a slow, cruel smile. Major, he said softly, too quiet for most to hear. I knew something was off. The judge's gavel slammed. Order. My pulse steadied itself through discipline. I faced him fully, the mask no longer necessary. You taught me about duty, Sergeant, I said, voice clear and cold. Let me teach you about honor. The words hit like a command. Every soldier in the room straightened instinctively, the hierarchy flipping for one instant of pure truth. Cole's face twisted. You think they'll let you walk after this? They'll let justice walk, I said. The colonel at the bench stared at me long enough to make time fold in half. Then he said quietly, Let the record reflect the witness's statement stands. The rest blurred legal citations, final arguments, the sound of papers rustling. When the gavel finally fell, the verdict was simple charges, sustained, dishonorable discharge pending full court-martial, immediate custody ordered. As MPs cuffed him again, Cole turned once more. The fury was gone now, replaced by something hollow, almost pleading. You'll regret this, he said. Maybe I answered, but not as much as you'll regret teaching me how the system works. He was led away, footsteps echoing like a fading drumbeat. The courtroom exhaled. I saluted the judge before stepping out. No one stopped me. Outside, the sun over Fort Hood burned white, erasing shadows from the pavement. For the first time, the base looked honest. When the sentence came down, it landed with the dull precision of military paperwork. Cole Bishop reduced in rank, dishonorably discharged and confined to Fort Leavenworth for 6 months pending final review. The official phrasing called it a short-term custodial term for conduct unbecoming. I called it a start. His name was stripped from the roster, his awards revoked, his commendations archived under restricted access. For a man who worshipped hierarchy, losing it was a living death. I stayed long enough to watch the process begin, then filed my own transfer papers. No fanfare, no farewell, just a signature and a quiet exit. Justice was never supposed to look cinematic. It looked like forms protocols, silence finally bending toward truth. When I crossed the checkpoint leaving Fort Hood for the last time, I didn't look back. The sun was too bright, the wind too hot, the whole base humming like a machine that would keep running without noticing one missing part. I drove east for 10 hours until the signs for Fort Bragg appeared again. Home. Or something resembling it. The pine trees looked the same, the air sharper, the cadence of morning drills echoing across the training fields like the heartbeat of a place that didn't care about personal ghosts. I checked into base housing under my own name. This time, Major Lauren Creed, no aliases, no borrowed identity, no pretense. The clerk didn't question why I looked like a woman whose story had already been written twice. I unpacked in silence uniform, folded with the precision of habit boots lined in a row like witnesses. For the first time in months, I slept without pretending to be anyone else. Days passed unremarkable and clean. The rhythm of structure returned 0800 staff meetings, logistics briefings, evening reports. My subordinates treated me with the same distant respect I'd always commanded. They didn't know where I'd been. The Army didn't ask. It preferred tidy endings even when built on ashes. A week later, as I left headquarters, I saw her. Lena stood by the gate, civilian clothes, clinging to her frame. Hair longer, eyes uncertain. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight had left, but so had the shape. When she spotted me, she hesitated before walking closer. Lauren. Her voice was fragile but steady. I stopped a few feet away. For a second, neither of us moved. Soldiers passed between us, their boots striking rhythm on the pavement, indifferent witnesses to reunion. "How did you find me?" I asked. "You left a trail," she said, almost smiling. A quiet one, but I knew where it would end. The wind carried the faint sound of morning cadence from across the field, hundreds of voices shouting in perfect unison, the same discipline that had built us both and broken her. "You saw the news I asked. I saw everything she said. They sent me updates. Ramirez called after the hearing. Said you handled it." "Handled it," I repeated softly. "That's one way to put it." Her hands trembled slightly and she folded them together to hide it. "Was it worth it?" she asked. The question hit harder than anything Cole had ever said. Worth. The word felt foreign now, like currency from a country that no longer existed. I looked at her, really looked, and saw the woman she had become, scarred, but breathing free, but afraid of what freedom meant after so much captivity. "It was never about worth," I said finally. "It was about balance." She blinked, the words settling in slowly. "Balance justice doesn't weigh the same for everyone," I said. "It just stops the scale from tilting too far." She nodded, eyes glistening. "You sound like Mom," she whispered. "Maybe," I said, "but Mom never burned the rule book." She laughed a small broken sound, and for a moment we were just sisters again. No ranks, no lies, no borrowed names. Then the silence returned, not cruel, just necessary. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Stay," I said. "Command still needs officers who remember why the system exists." "And me?" she asked, voice trembling. "What am I supposed to be now?" "Alive," I said. "That's enough for today." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of pine and dust. A convoy rolled past, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Lena wiped her eyes, stepped forward and hugged me quick, uncertain, like testing the temperature of forgiveness. I didn't move at first, then let my arms rise, one hand resting between her shoulders, the way I used to steady recruits after their first field fall. When she pulled back, she looked stronger, or maybe I just needed to believe that she was. "You can't keep protecting everyone," she said quietly. "I don't," I answered. "I just don't let anyone rewrite the ending." She smiled, then small but real. The guard at the gate waved a line of cars through. The base resumed its rhythm. The world didn't pause for our closure, but it didn't need to. As she turned to leave, I called out Lena. She stopped, glancing over her shoulder. "Don't let what he did be the loudest thing in your life." She nodded once, then walked toward the civilian road, her figure dissolving into the afternoon haze. I stood there until the gate closed again, the clang echoing like punctuation. The Army kept marching, the system kept turning. But somewhere deep inside its machinery, a small correction had been made. Balance restored, however briefly. November 2025 arrived like a scar that never quite healed. A year had passed since the hearing, but Fort Bragg still felt heavy with echoes of that day. The Army had moved on new scandals, new deployments, new names to salute, but ghosts have their own calendar. I was finishing a logistics review when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. The message was short, almost polite. "Bishop. Out early. Need to talk. Killeen." I stared at the screen for a long time before deleting it, but silence doesn't stop persistence. 2 days later, another message. One conversation. That's all. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Closure has a strange gravity. Even soldiers aren't immune to its pull. The cafe sat off the main road near downtown Killeen, a quiet place with old photographs of paratroopers on the walls. I arrived first, choosing the booth facing the entrance. The room smelled of coffee and old leather, the kind of place where history lingers in every corner. At exactly 1300, he walked in. I recognized him instantly, though prison had stripped away his polish. Cole Bishop no longer moved like command, he moved like consequence. His uniform was gone, replaced by jeans and a plain gray shirt. The swagger had melted into something desperate. He hesitated before sitting across from me, eyes flicking to my insignia. I was still in uniform, a deliberate choice. "Major Creed," he said, voice low. "Didn't expect you'd come." "You asked for a meeting," I said flatly. "You got one. What do you want?" He swallowed hard. "You probably know I was released early. Good behavior overcrowding all that bureaucratic mercy." "Mercy isn't the word I'd use." He forced a dry laugh. "Fair. Look, I didn't ask you here to fight. I came to apologize." The word sounded unnatural in his mouth. "I've had a year to think," he said. "About the things I did. About Lena. About how I let it all rot." I said nothing. He leaned forward, hands clasped tightly. "You have to believe me, Creed. I was raised on rules same as you. Somewhere along the line, I started thinking the rules were mine to enforce." His voice cracked slightly. "I paid for that." "No," I said. "You were corrected for it." "That's not the same thing." He winced. "Semantics." "No," I repeated. "Discipline." The pause that followed was thick enough to breathe. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I'm asking for a chance. I've got nothing. No unit, no pension, no one willing to give me a start. You still have influence. If you could write a letter, just a character reference, I could apply for civilian logistics work." His gaze was pleading, his arrogance replaced by something that almost looked human. Almost. I studied him for a long time, searching for sincerity, but all I saw was a man who still believed redemption was transactional. "You want me to validate you?" I asked. "No," he said quickly. "I want to work, to build something." "You, of all people, should understand that." "I do," I said. "But work without humility is just control in another form." He flinched but didn't back down. "You think I can't change?" "I think change isn't yours to request," I said. "It's earned." He looked away, staring out the window where traffic slid past under the pale Texas sun. "You sound like command again," he muttered. "Maybe I should salute." "You don't need to," I said coldly. "The Army already did it for you when they turned their back." He turned back to me, anger flickering behind the exhaustion. "You ruined me." "No," I said. "You did that yourself. I just wrote the report." He leaned closer, voice trembling now. "So, that's it. You don't believe in forgiveness." I met his gaze squarely. "Forgiveness isn't in my jurisdiction." Request denied. The words came out flat, procedural, final. He stared at me as if the phrase had punched the air from his lungs. After a moment, he pushed his chair back and stood. "You always did talk like a damn report," he said. "Guess some people can't live without structure." "Structure's what keeps us human," I replied. "You just mistook control for order." He didn't answer. He tossed a few bills on the table, hands shaking slightly, then turned to leave. For a second, I thought that was the end, that the circle had closed with nothing but silence between us. But fate, like justice, loves symmetry. As he stepped out into the street, a car horn blared. He froze mid-crosswalk, caught between light and shadow. The vehicle skidded tires, screaming, and clipped his shoulder. He spun, hit the pavement hard. The sound wasn't fatal, just final. The driver jumped out shouting apologies. I stood at the window watching as people gathered. Cole pushed himself upright, dazed but alive. Blood trickled down his temple, just enough to sting, not enough to save. Karma never aims to kill. It just reminds. He glanced back once and saw me through the glass. Our eyes met for the last time. I didn't move. He lifted a trembling hand, maybe to wave, maybe to curse, then dropped it and limped away down the sidewalk, swallowed by afternoon glare. I stayed until the traffic resumed and the world pretended nothing had happened. Then I finished my coffee stood and adjusted my collar. Outside, the sky was the same steel gray color it had been a year ago. Balance doesn't always look like peace. Sometimes it looks like survival. The following spring, the North Carolina air smelled like rain and renewal. The court-martial hearings had ended, the paperwork was filed, and the base settled back into its rhythm of drills, marches, and quiet forgetfulness. But I couldn't go back to pretending silence was safety. There were too many Lenas in the world, too many women who knew how to smile through a bruise and salute through fear. That was how Creed House began, not as an act of charity, but of maintenance. Justice wasn't about punishment. It was about building something that made future silence impossible. The Army wouldn't fund it, of course. They offered statements of support, not signatures. So we built it outside the gates on a half-acre lot overlooking the southern access road to Fort Bragg, a place where soldiers passed every day but never really looked. The sign was simple white paint on dark wood hand-carved letters, Creed House for military families, seeking shelter and clarity. It wasn't just a refuge, it was a statement. We didn't ask for permission, we just opened the doors. Lena handled the intake side listening, documenting, connecting the women to legal and medical aid. I managed logistics, funding schedules, coordination with advocacy networks. Structure was my native language, healing was hers. Between us, we found equilibrium. The first week, 2 women came. One was an Army spouse from Fayetteville, another was a Marine veteran who couldn't say the word home without shaking. They slept in borrowed bunks and woke up crying from dreams that sounded too familiar. We didn't tell them what to do, we just gave them order chores, breakfast at 700, check-ins at 1200, lights out at 2200. Order wasn't control anymore, it was stability. The structure that once trapped them now steadied them. Word spread quietly through the base. The command never acknowledged it publicly, but some officers sent anonymous donations. Even a few MPs stopped by under the pretense of security checks, but left envelopes on the counter. The hypocrisy of the system had finally met its correction, grassroots, unregistered, undeniable. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the pine trees, Lena and I stood by the new flagpole outside the house. We had just finished repainting the porch, our hands streaked with white. The air was thick with humidity, fireflies flickering along the fence line. In the distance, we could hear the faint echo of cadence from the bass voices shouting left, left, like the world was still marching forward no matter what had changed. "You really think this will last?" she asked, her voice soft. "No," I said honestly, "but it'll matter as long as it does." She handed me the folded flag white cloth with no emblem, no nation, no command, no rank, just blank peace. Together we raised it slowly, the metal rope clinking against the pole. When it reached the top, the cloth unfurled and caught the wind gleaming pale under the last light of day. Soldiers driving past slowed their vehicles, confused at first, then nodding when they saw the two of us standing there side by side. Lena wiped her hands on her jeans. "It's strange," she said quietly. "I used to think peace would feel lighter." "It doesn't," I said. "It just stops hurting." She looked at me, the question in her eyes unspoken. I answered it anyway. Sometimes peace comes dressed as discipline. The words came out softer than I intended, like a prayer I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. She smiled faintly. "You always did find poetry in orders." "Orders keep people alive," I said, "and this time they might even keep them free." That night we stayed outside long after dark, watching headlights glide across the distant road. Somewhere in that quiet, I felt something loosen the part of me that had stayed locked in battle even after the war was over. I realized peace wasn't a medal you earned. It was a system you built from scratch, one regulation at a time, one healed woman at a time. By midnight, the house lights were dimmed. Inside, the sound of soft breathing filled the halls, women sleeping without fear for the first time in years. I sat by the window, writing the day's final notes into a logbook titled Daily Accountability. Old habits never die, they just change purpose. Under the final entry, I wrote, "No incidents, no outbursts, no silence." The next morning, the flag was still flying. The soldiers on their morning run saluted without being told why. Maybe they didn't need to. Maybe they just recognized the quiet dignity of correction. As I stood by the door watching Lena hand out coffee to the women gathered around the kitchen table, I thought about what Cole once said, that the Army protected him. Maybe it had. But now it protected something better. A system built not on fear, but on recovery. A chain of command rewritten by survivors. And at the gate of Fort Bragg, where thousands marched toward duty, two sisters had finally rewritten the meaning of honor. It started with an article buried deep in the Army Times page 7 bottom half no byline. The title read, "An Officer Who Taught Accountability." The piece was unsigned, but anyone who had served long enough could recognize the tone. It was written by someone inside, someone who had seen the quiet reshaping of command culture from within. The article spoke of a senior logistics officer at Fort Bragg who had uncovered corruption, exposed domestic misconduct, and left behind a system that could no longer pretend not to see. It didn't name me, but it didn't have to. Every paragraph carried my cadence. Every sentence bore my fingerprints. I read it alone in the Creed House kitchen, the early morning light cutting across the table. The coffee had gone cold by the time I reached the last line. Leadership is not compliance. Leadership is consequence. I traced those words with my finger, not as pride, but as recognition. The Army moves like tectonic plates, slow grinding inevitable, but sometimes one fracture changes the landscape. A week later, a formal invitation arrived in the mail embossed with the crest of the United States Military Academy. West Point requests the presence of Major Lauren Creed as a guest lecturer for the Fall Leadership Ethics Forum. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. The irony wasn't lost on me. The institution that had taught me how to follow rules was now asking me to explain how to break them properly. I accepted, of course. The day of the lecture arrived crisp and gray, the Hudson River curling like steel ribbon below the bluff. Cadets in immaculate dress uniforms filled the small auditorium, their faces open and unweathered, not yet marked by the quiet compromises of command. I stood at the podium in my service dress medals tucked away, except for the single silver oak leaf on my shoulder, just enough to signify not to boast. I was asked to speak about leadership, I began, but leadership isn't a concept, it's a cost. The room went still. I could see their attention sharpen the way soldiers focus when they sense they're hearing something that won't be in the manual. "You'll be told leadership means discipline, structure, order," I continued. And it does, but order without integrity is tyranny. Discipline without empathy is cruelty, and structure without accountability is just silence wearing medals. A hand went up from the front row, a young cadet with a clean jawline and eyes full of the kind of certainty I used to have. "Ma'am," he said, "how do you decide when it's right to disobey?" I looked at him for a long moment, letting the question hang. "You don't decide," I said. "You recognize. When obedience starts protecting injustice, you stop following and start leading." Murmurs rippled through the room, half awe, half discomfort. The faculty advisor shifted uneasily in the corner, but I kept going. "Leadership isn't silence," I said quietly. "It's standing in the ruins you made right." That line wasn't in the notes. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere raw. The cadet nodded slowly, and for a moment I saw Lena in his place, wide-eyed, believing rules could fix what people broke. Maybe she still believed that, but I'd seen too much to leave it untested. After the lecture, a young woman approached me outside the hall. She couldn't have been more than 21, uniform crisp boots polished to a mirror shine. "Major Creed," she asked, hesitant. "My mom stayed at your shelter 2 years ago." I froze. She smiled faintly. "She said you taught her how to salute again, not to anyone else, just to herself." For a second, I couldn't speak. I just nodded, the weight of that truth heavier than any medal. "Tell her she taught herself," I managed to say. "We just gave her room to remember how." She saluted sharp, precise, and perfect, and walked away. I stood there long after she disappeared into the crowd of cadets, the sound of marching feet echoing down the corridor. That night, as the academy lights glowed across the river, I sat alone on the guest house porch, watching the water move below. The reflection of the stars shimmered across its surface like 1,000 fragments of command, broken, refracted, but still visible. My phone buzzed once, a message from Lena. "The flag's still flying. 6 new women this month. Ramirez stopped by, said to tell you you're overdue for rest." I smiled at that. Rest was a foreign country, but the idea of peace earned, built, maintained that I could understand. I typed back, "Tell him the mission's still active. Standing by." Then I set the phone down and looked toward the distant academy spires silhouetted against the night. The Army hadn't changed overnight. It never would. but the culture had a crack now, a line of fire running through it that no one could ignore. And if leadership meant anything, it was that you carried the flame not to burn the system down, but to light the corners it preferred to keep dark. By the spring of 2026, the Army's paperwork finally caught up with its conscience. I received the promotion quietly. No parade, no formal ceremony. Just a handshake from the commanding general in a carpeted office that smelled faintly of coffee and dust. The new rank slid onto my shoulders with the same weight as the old one, but something deeper had shifted. Lieutenant Colonel Lauren Creed. The title didn't feel like triumph. It felt like reclamation. The citation that accompanied it was short, for exceptional leadership under conditions of moral and institutional adversity. That phrasing made the other officers murmur too elegant, too ambiguous, but it was perfect. The Army doesn't say thank you, it codifies memory in paperwork. I accepted it the only way I knew how, with composure and silence. That evening, as I left headquarters, I paused by the reflecting pool near the parade field. The sunset bled gold across the surface fractured by the wind. For a moment, I saw two silhouettes instead of one myself, and another woman, laughing in cadet gray, the echo of a time before rank, before disillusionment, before we learned that honor sometimes meant defiance. The memory pulled me back to our first day at ROTC in Raleigh. Lena and I were 18 standing at attention in the humid Carolina air while a senior cadet barked instructions. The field smelled of cut grass and nervous resolve. Lena had whispered barely audible, "If one of us makes it, we both do." I'd smirked, then already too serious for my age, and replied, "And if one of us falls, we both rise." It became our code long before either of us understood what it would cost. That vow had carried through wars, marriages, betrayals, and rebirths. And now, years later, it was finally fulfilled not through medals or titles, but through endurance. The Creed House still stood just beyond the southern gate of Fort Bragg, its white flag flying clean against the sky. The press had written small stories about it, a grassroots recovery program for military families, but no one mentioned our names. That was how we wanted it. Not fame, continuity. The women who passed through didn't need saviors, they needed systems, and we'd given them one. On the anniversary of the house's founding, Lena asked me to visit. I arrived in full uniform, still not used to the silver oak leaves catching sunlight on my collar. The road leading to the house was quiet, the kind of stillness that hums with meaning. When I pulled up, Lena was already outside, wearing a pale blouse and dark jeans, her hair tied back the way she used to when we were teenagers. The sight of her standing there in the light made the years collapse into one another. "You're early," she called out, smiling. "I'm Army," I replied. "We measure time in minutes, not feelings." She laughed and shook her head. "Still quoting regulations, still ignoring them," I said. We stood for a while without speaking, watching the breeze ripple through the flag. The white cloth caught the sun just right, the edges glowing like a beacon. "You know," she said softly, "I never told you this, but after you left Fort Hood, I couldn't sleep for weeks. Every night I thought I'd see him again, but what scared me more was the thought that I wouldn't see you." I turned toward her, but she didn't meet my eyes. "You're here now," I said, "and that's the only part that still matters." She nodded. "You think it's over?" "No," I said. "It just changed shape." The air grew warm, the smell of honeysuckle drifting in from the road. In the distance, the faint sound of cadence floated across the fields. Young recruits at morning drills, shouting in perfect rhythm, unaware of the history written in the soil beneath their boots. Lena looked toward the base, shading her eyes. "It's strange," she murmured. "That place used to terrify me. Now I see it and I think maybe it can learn." "Institutions don't learn," I said. "People do. Then they rewrite the manuals." She smiled faintly. "So, what do we call yours?" I hesitated, then answered the Creed Protocol. What's that supposed to mean? That leadership without accountability burns everything it touches. I said. "So the protocol is simple. When the fire comes, you stand in it until it stops hurting." She laughed quietly. "Only you would turn morality into a field exercise. It's the only language command understands." We both laughed, then the sound carrying across the open field. The light shifted the sky, turning a rich, honeyed gold. She reached out suddenly and adjusted the edge of my collar, a small, familiar gesture that brought back years of shared mirrors and borrowed makeup and whispered courage. "You wear it well," she said softly. "You earned it twice over." I didn't answer. Instead, I stepped back, straightened my shoulders, and saluted her the way I would any commanding officer who'd changed the mission. For a heartbeat, she froze, startled. Then she placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head slightly, her blouse catching the last streak of sunlight. The wind lifted around us, carrying dust and memory alike. Behind her, the Creed house gleamed white, the flag rippling against the Texas-tinged sky. Two sisters, one soldier, one survivor, both standing exactly where their vow had promised they'd be. As the day settled into dusk, I lowered my hand and said the words that had lived in me since that first morning at ROTC. For those who rise when others fall. The world grew quiet, and the flag answered with its steady whisper. Balance restored, duty fulfilled, peace at last wearing the face of discipline. The screen fades from the bright Texas sky to the subdued gold of early evening where the light no longer burns but breathes. Lauren Creed stands on the ridge behind Creed House, her posture still immaculate, the silver leaves on her collar catching glints of sunset. The camera lingers not on her face but on the flag above her, white and luminous against the horizon, its edges trembling with the wind like a heartbeat that refuses to fade. The drumline begins softly, slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. This is not a march, it's a reckoning. Her voice enters over the sound low and steady, the kind of calm that carries more authority than any shout. Every family has a code, she says. Ours was simple: if you wear the uniform, you don't get to hide behind it. The line isn't delivered like a slogan. It lands like a verdict. Her breath steadies between words, her tone cold but not cruel, the kind of composure that only comes from someone who's already seen the cost of truth. Behind her, the base lights flicker on, one by one, small dots of order in a landscape that's learned to live with chaos. She turns slightly, looking down toward the road. Cars pass occasionally, officers heading home, cadets heading out, civilians cutting through. None of them know they're part of her closure. None of them need to. Her voice continues. For years, people thought the uniform made us untouchable. That discipline was protection. That silence kept things clean. But silence doesn't protect anyone. It just delays the sound of the explosion. The wind catches the edge of her hair, brushing it against her cheek. Her expression doesn't change. I learned that justice doesn't arrive on time. She continues, her voice quieter now, almost reflective. It arrives when someone stops waiting for permission. It arrives when you decide that rules can't matter more than people. That's when leadership begins. That's when accountability stops being theory and starts becoming fire. Cut to footage of Creed House women painting the porch railing, folding uniforms in the laundry room, laughing quietly over coffee. The narration doesn't pause. People ask me if I regret what I did, she says. The infiltration, the exposure, the lies I wore like skin. I don't, because if truth requires camouflage, then I'll wear it every day until the system sees itself. The drumbeat fades to a softer rhythm, something that feels like the sound of a heart sinking with time. The visuals switch brief flashes of her past the ROTC field in Raleigh, the courtroom, the article headline, the flag being raised. All fragments, but together they tell a full circle. Lauren's silhouette stands still as the camera drifts around her from behind, revealing the expanse of Fort Bragg bathed in fading sunlight. Her voice, now gentler, carries weight through restraint. Some call it revenge. Some call it rebellion. I call it correction. Because revenge ends when you hurt someone. Correction begins when the truth hurts back. The phrase echoes, underscored by the whisper of the wind through the pines. Every uniform has two sides, she says after a pause. The one the world salutes, and the one that hides the people who never learned to be accountable. But if you wear that uniform, if you represent something bigger than yourself, then you carry every oath like a mirror. You can't lie to it. You can only decide which reflection survives. She looks back at the flag, the light reflecting in her eyes. For a moment, the camera holds close enough to see the faint scar near her temple, barely visible, almost healed. A reminder that pain doesn't vanish, it integrates. Then, her voice softens to something personal, intimate, like she's speaking to one person instead of millions. I didn't start this story to prove anything. I started it because one night I found my sister on the floor, shaking, bleeding, apologizing for surviving. That's the night I understood something I should have known all along. Honor means nothing if it only exists on paper. It has to live in the way we treat each other when no one is saluting. The wind lifts stronger now, pulling the white flag outward. It glows under the last burst of light, the background fading into the cool blue of dusk. Lauren continues, voice unwavering. So, if you're watching this, whether you served or you loved someone who did, or you just believe that strength isn't cruelty, I want you to remember something. She turns fully to the camera, now facing the audience directly. Her posture is perfect, her chin steady, her tone neither pleading nor angry, just absolute clarity. Honor is earned, not granted. Respect is built, not demanded. And family by blood or by oath means nothing if it costs someone their peace. The music swells slightly, strings joining the drum. Wherever you are, she adds, if you understand that, then you're part of this code too. A soft pause follows, deliberate and long enough to let the words settle. Then she gives the signature closing line, the CTA that transforms the monologue into a call for connection. If you agree that honor is earned, not granted, drop your city and your local time below. Tell me where you're watching from, and I'll salute you from Fort Bragg. The camera slowly zooms out as she raises her hand in a final solemn salute. The sun dips behind her, casting a long silhouette across the grass. The flag waves above, brilliant against the fading sky. Fade to black. Then, in quiet white letters, every story ends. But integrity doesn't. The screen lingers on darkness for a few seconds after her salute fades, then the light returns, soft, amber, intimate. The scene reopens inside Creed House at dawn. Steam rises from coffee mugs, sunlight filters through gauzy curtains, and the low hum of women talking overlaps with the sound of boots on hardwood. The voiceover begins again, steady, deliberate, Lauren's tone more introspective now, but still edged with steel. They told me once that every uniform carries two weights, the weight of duty and the weight of conscience. Most people learn to live with one. The rest of us learn to carry both. The camera follows her walking slowly down the hallway, the polished floors reflecting her steps. She passes open doors, a mother teaching her daughter to tie her shoes. Two veterans comparing scars they no longer hide. A woman pinning a new set of photos to a corkboard marked goals. These details don't just fill space, they testify. Justice isn't a moment. Her voice continues, it's maintenance, it's paperwork. It's conversations that start with "I'm sorry" and end with "you're safe." It's the quiet rebuilding of systems that once chose convenience over courage. And it never ever feels cinematic when you're the one doing it. She steps outside into the open air where a small group of women are repainting the fence white over weathered brown. One of them, a young army spouse, looks up and nods. Lauren nods back, no words exchanged. Respect doesn't need sound. You learn over time that leadership isn't about standing taller, she says. It's about standing still when everyone else looks away. About saying no when silence would make you look stronger. A montage plays Lauren speaking at a leadership seminar, reviewing logistics forms at her desk, checking on the flagpole at night when the wind starts to rise. In the background, Lena appears beside her clipboard and hand hair tied back. They exchange a brief glance, a shared rhythm of purpose. The narration slows, her tone softening like she's speaking to her younger self. When I first joined ROTC, I thought leadership was about control, about precision, salutes perfection. I thought being a good officer meant being the calmest in the chaos. But years later, standing in front of that courtroom, I realized calm means nothing if you're standing on the wrong side of the truth. The shot shifts to a flashback, the Article 32 courtroom, the harsh fluorescent lights, Cole's silhouette in cuffs. The sound fades under the drum echo, replaced by her calm voice. You can't train for moments like that. No field manual prepares you for looking evil in the eyes and realizing it saluted the same flag you did. Then back to the present, Lauren standing on the porch, her hands resting on the railing, the horizon just beginning to brighten. I've been asked what kept me steady, she continues. The answer's simple procedure. The same structure that trained me to survive also gave me the tools to fight back. Justice doesn't come from chaos, it comes from discipline turned inward. She looks toward the base in the distance, faint outlines of soldiers beginning their morning run. The sound of cadence floats faintly on the wind, echoes of the life she still belongs to, but no longer fears. When we raised that white flag, it wasn't surrender, she says. It was redefinition. White doesn't mean silence anymore. It means clean ground. It means the story begins again without the bruises. Cut to Lena tending to the garden near the fence, kneeling as she plants small white lilies in neat rows. She hums softly to herself, a sound almost drowned by the wind, but unmistakably human. Lauren steps beside her, handing her a trowel. They don't speak. They just work. People think healing looks gentle. Lauren's voice continues. It doesn't. It's exhausting. It's ugly. It's choosing every single day not to let the past rewrite you. A slow instrumental begins a cello and snare combination that mirrors the beat of a march, slowed to human pace. Fort Bragg was built on repetition orders drills protocol. For years, I believed those repetitions were armor, but now they're reminders. Every cadence, every step, every inspection, it's all a ritual of accountability. You can't march forward if you refuse to count the ground you've already covered. The camera pans across the base road as the morning sun breaks fully over the horizon. Soldiers in formation jog past Creed House, their eyes briefly catching the white flag that ripples above the roofline. Some nod, one salutes. The gesture isn't official, it's acknowledgement. Lauren's voice grows quieter. Some of them know the story, some pretend not to. That's fine. Change doesn't need recognition, it just needs endurance. The camera returns to her face lines of fatigue around the eyes, but steady. She looks older now, but also lighter. Lena once asked me if it was worth it, she says, and I told her it was never about worth, it was about balance. I still believe that, because justice isn't measured in victories. It's measured in the silence you no longer have to live with. The scene transitions to the flag again, high in the wind, flanked by the shadows of pine trees. The camera begins to pull back slowly, revealing the full property Creed House surrounded by open field, the base faint in the background, its structures glowing gold in the early light. Lauren's voice takes on a final calm authority, the cadence of a command meant for hearts instead of soldiers. So, if you've been watching this, wondering why stories like this matter, remember this much discipline built the machine, but empathy keeps it human. You can't have one without the other. You can't protect a flag if you don't protect the people standing under it. The screen fades briefly to black, then opens again on a tight close-up of her hand holding a folded piece of paper, the old ROTC photo of her and Lena, creased faded corners worn. She unfolds it carefully, looks at it for a moment, then tucks it into her jacket. Her voice, softer now, carries through the transition. We started as two cadets promising to watch each other's backs. We ended as two women proving that promises don't end, they evolve. Cut to black again. A faint sound of wind fills the silence. Then in her voice, one final thought, neither narration nor confession, just a statement of record. And if you're still watching, then maybe you're part of this too. Maybe you're ready to carry the code. The drumbeat rises again, slow and deliberate, like the sound of a heart learning to trust its own rhythm. Fade out. The screen fades back from black into a shot bathed in deep blue twilight. The camera pans slowly across the parade fields of Fort Bragg, empty now, wind sweeping the grass into long ripples that move like memory. The faint echo of cadence hangs in the distance, not from soldiers this time, but from the rhythm of the earth itself. The soundtrack has softened to the steady heartbeat of a snare drum, each beat stretching like breath. Lauren stands alone on the ridge again, but this time the perspective is wider. Behind her, Creed House glows with warm light, every window alive with silhouettes, the living proof of everything that came after the fire. Her uniform is crisp boots planted firmly. Her salute, lowered now not out of disrespect, but completion. Her voice enters measured reflective, carrying that calm resonance that has defined her all along. When you've spent your life in command, you start believing leadership means giving orders. But real leadership is quieter. It's the sound of people rebuilding because you made space for them to start again. The camera cuts to flashes of moments from earlier chapters. Lena laughing under the porch light, the white flag rising, Ramirez handing over a file. The courtroom gavel striking down Cole's hollow eyes through glass. Then the montage slows on a single frame, Lauren as a cadet in gray, young and unscarred sunlight hitting her eyes like a promise. Her voice overlays softly. I used to think justice meant punishment. I know better now. Justice is correction. It's the steady alignment of truth after everything's fallen apart. She steps forward, her silhouette framed against the horizon. The wind is strong now, the white flag snapping like a heartbeat. There's something they never tell you about truth, she says. It doesn't save you, it refines you. It burns away what doesn't belong and leaves only what can survive the fire. That's why I called it the Creed Protocol. It's not a rule, it's a reminder. The music shifts, strings blending with the drum, a slow crescendo that feels earned, not forced. The shot cuts to the inside of Creed House. A small plaque by the door reads EST 2025, founded in honor, built in courage. Women sit around a table writing letters, the sound of pens on paper steady and rhythmic. The narration continues. Every story leaves a residue. Some call it trauma, some call it wisdom. I call it signal, because every time one of us stands up, someone else hears the frequency and realizes they can stand too. The light fades warmer, more golden. Children's laughter filters faintly from the back porch. The camera finds Lena again. She's older now, calm, her hands steady as she folds a clean white bedsheet. The symbolism is quiet, but deliberate. No more hiding bruises, only tending to peace. Lauren's voice softens to a whisper. When my sister walked back into the sun, she thought the world would look the same. It didn't. It looked brighter. That's what truth does. It doesn't fix what broke, but it makes you see where you were standing when it did. The camera drifts upward, revealing the wide expanse of Fort Bragg, the fields glowing faintly gold in the last light of day. Her voice gains a note of finality, the kind that only comes from acceptance, not resignation. Maybe someday no one will need places like Creed House. Maybe the codes will change. Maybe leadership will mean listening first. But until that day, we stand our post. Cut to a close-up of Lauren's hands resting on the railing, calm, still scarred. She glances upward as the flag shifts direction, the wind carrying it straight toward the camera. Her final monologue begins, every line paced like a march, every word weighted like a truth earned through fire. You don't heal by forgetting, she says. You heal by remembering differently. You don't lead by commanding. You lead by standing in the ruins and refusing to leave until they are rebuilt. And you don't protect freedom by silence. You protect it by speaking when no one else will. Her expression hardens slightly, her tone steady as command returns, but this time it carries grace. So wherever you are, whether you served or you just survived something that tried to break you, remember this, the uniform isn't sacred. The people inside it are. The drumbeat slows, each thud now distant, echoing like a pulse fading into eternity. The camera begins its long, final pullback up and away from Creed House, past the white flag still glowing against the dark, past the fields, past the trees. The base lights below resemble constellations, small, steadfast points of human effort in a vast sea of night. Lauren's voice comes one last time, quiet, intimate, almost like a prayer whispered to no one and everyone at once. If you've watched this far, you already understand. You don't need rank to live with honor. You don't need medals to earn peace. And you don't need permission to be decent. Every family has a code. Ours was simple: if you wear the uniform, you don't get to hide behind it. The music swells for one last time, carrying the emotional weight upward as her silhouette fades into dusk. Wherever you're watching from, she adds, voice now breaking the fourth wall completely. If you still believe honor is earned, not granted, then stand tall. Drop your city and local time below, and I'll salute you from Fort Bragg. The screen cuts to black. A faint metallic sound, the click of boots coming to attention, echoes through the dark. Then, in white text, the final words appear slowly across the screen. For those who rise when others fall. Fade to silence. Then the sound of one last drumbeat. End.